Oh, good.
That's small even with glasses on.
What's that?
So that's small even with glasses on.
Yeah, I happen to know where a lot of the things that I got to click on are. So, anyways, so this part of the blood vessels chapter, we're really looking at the functionality of things and about blood pressure. In lab, wait a second. Wednesday lab yesterday, we did blood vessels, right?
Yeah.
So you guys actually have your practical after break, right? Okay. When I was saying all that, I was saying when we're back from break, everything will be kind of normal, but actually not, but whatever. So I realized in lab yesterday with the Wednesday group that I forgot to talk about blood pressure in lab on Monday. So I want to talk about that a little bit here and some of the aspects of how we actually measure blood pressure. So this first picture is certainly straight up lecture material. And this just shows how blood pressure declines throughout the circulatory system. So down at the bottom, we have laid out here the different blood vessels that blood moves through. They start with the aorta specifically, which is really just one of the elastic arteries. And from the aorta, the blood will move into other elastic arteries, which will then move into muscular arteries, which will then move into arterioles, then into capillaries, and then into venules, and then into veins. The book separates the veins up structurally into medium and large. There's a picture of that. Wait, did I get to that on?
I think so. Yeah.
I did? Let me just, I want to be sure. Yeah, let me just be sure I actually say, it's not, I don't have to say a whole lot about it, but I just want to point out. So we looked at this picture of the wall. That's not the one I'm talking about. Sorry, that was kind of funny. We looked at this picture of the different types of arteries. We looked at this picture of the different types of capillaries. Did we look at this picture of the different types of veins? Okay, this will just take a minute, but I do want to make this point because it is relevant to what I'm about to say. So I showed you the three different pictures of arteries. There's the elastic arteries, muscular arteries, arterioles. They have a similar picture for veins, but it's not really the same point. They have a large vein and a medium-sized vein, and they actually draw them slightly differently, showing a valve here in the medium-sized vein and not one in the large vein. This is really just a size differentiation, and it somewhat depends on where you put the cutoff in size, what we call large versus medium. So in some ways of thinking about it, large veins might actually have valves in them. I don't know that that's really a fair way of putting it. So really the large and medium-sized veins are essentially the same thing. They're just veins. What is different are the venules here. Okay. All the labels here are just showing the different structures in the vein wall, which we already looked at when we were just looking at the general layers of things. Okay. But the point here, again, that I'm making is we have elastic arteries, muscular arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and then we don't have a separate category for medium and large-sized veins because really they're not that distinctive categories. They're just veins. And then they put the Vena Cava at the end by itself, which is just one of the veins, just like the aorta is one of the elastic arteries. So really in these figures, and there are a few others in the book that we'll look at, along the x-axis, they're just laying out the circulatory system. We could kind of say it's just distance from the heart. So we start at the heart, we move through those types of arteries, capillaries, venules, veins. And they're just blocking it off into different categories based on where they are in circulation. Okay. So what we see here is the blood pressure drops off as we move from the arteries into the arterioles and the capillaries and the venules and the veins. The pressure is based on the beating of the heart. When the left ventricle contracts and it pushes blood out, the blood that's being ejected is in the 80 to 120 millimeters of mercury range of pressure. And then once the blood gets back to the heart, once it comes back to the right atrium, it's practically at zero pressure, 0 millimeters of mercury pressure. It's actually not at 0 millimeters of mercury pressure, but it's really close. It has to be a little bit higher than that because the pressure in the atrium has to be higher than the pressure in the ventricle on the right side so that blood gets to the ventricle. But that's the point. It starts very high because the pressure is really built up by the beating of the left ventricle, and it pushes blood throughout the whole circulatory system. Now, in the arterial side of circulation, the pressure is most accurately represented by this red line, and we see there's some variation that goes between 80 and 120. Okay, that's the numbers that we usually think of as the range for blood pressure. Those two values, 120 over 80, what we think of as the normal blood pressure, are really representing the pressure when the ventricle is in systole, so we call that systolic pressure. That's the higher of the two numbers. And diastolic pressure is the pressure when the ventricle is relaxed. Now, the pressure in the ventricle certainly drops much lower than 80, but when it gets below 80, the semilunar valve is closed, the aortic valve is closed. So the blood that's moving into the rest of the circulatory system has to be between 80 and 120, again, based on those normal numbers. But really, if we look at the pressure in the system at any singular time, any specific time, we're going to get some value somewhere in that range. And the red line going up and down just shows the heart beats and then it relaxes. The heart beats and it relaxes. It beats and relaxes. And so it keeps going back and forth here. Eventually, the number kind of collapses down into a constant pressure. And we're going to see that by the time we get to the arterioles, and especially when we get to the capillaries. We don't want variation in pressure that's driven by the beating action of the heart when we get that far through, because a steady pressure is very important to how nutrients and waste products are exchanged across capillary walls. And capillaries are very thin. They're not going to really be able to tolerate big changes in pressure. So the pressure has to be steadied by the time we get to that point in circulation. And then, of course, it's going to stay as a steady value for the rest of the time on down. So the gray lines outlining the red line here represent the range of blood pressure. But right down the middle is a line that represents a constant pressure. And that's labeled the mean arterial pressure, or MAP, it's often abbreviated. The word mean basically means average. So this is the average pressure in the arteries. It's not exactly the average pressure, and I'm going to explain that in a second, but that's what the term basically means. What was I going to say about that? Seems like I had one other thing to say about that, but don't worry about it. We'll go in here. So I put these in ahead of time because I wanted the, oh, that's what I was going to say. The difference between diastolic and systolic pressure is referred to as pulse pressure. When you're feeling somebody's pulse, the beat that you feel is just the variation between diastolic and systolic pressure. Okay. So the value that we would consider pulse pressure is the difference between those. So if we're talking 120 over 80, then pulse pressure is going to be the difference between those two numbers. what is the difference between 120 and 80? 40, right. Okay. So back over here. So 120 over 80 is our usual average kind of blood pressure. Again, that's systolic over diastolic pressures. And the pulse pressure is going to equal systolic minus diastolic pressure, which in this case is going to be 120 minus 80, which means that it's 40 millimeters of mercury. Now, I wanted to find pulse pressure in there because the way that we calculate mean arterial pressure is based on pulse pressure. They have it kind of written out here, but in fact, all it is mean arterial pressure is calculated by diastolic pressure plus the ratio of pulse pressure, which is systolic minus diastolic pressure, over 3. Okay. Hold on a second. Now, that might seem like a kind of strange equation, but I want to explain kind of where it comes from. Now, if we wanted to take an actual average of the 120 over 80 blood pressure, what would that be?
100.
Hmm?
100.
Yeah, the number perfectly in the middle there would be 100. That's simply 120 minus, plus 80 divided by 2. And it's a standard way of getting the average or something. Another way you can do that is to take 80 and add 120 minus 80, and that quantity divided by 2. Okay, so notice that gives us the exact same result. 80 plus 40 divided by 2 would be 100. Okay. Same idea. The mean arterial pressure equation that I have up here is essentially the same thing with one difference. What's the difference between what's written up here for mean arterial pressure versus how I just calculated the average between 120 and 80?
Is there any way we can like tilt it?
Yeah, it's actually, it moves a lot.
Good thing you're tall, though.
Yeah. It doesn't stay put though. And I was. Anyways, so what is different between the equation up here for how mean arterial pressure is going to be calculated and the mathematical approach I use down here at the bottom for getting the actual average between the numbers 120 and 80?
You divided by 2 instead of 3.
Yeah, that's the only difference. If we changed the 3 here to a 2, then we would get the actual average between those two numbers. For mean arterial pressure, we use 3 instead because the heart is in diastole, or I should say the left ventricle is in diastole for longer than it's in systole. 800 millisecond heartbeat, like we were talking about for the cardiac cycle earlier. About 300 milliseconds of that is ventricular systole, and the other 500 milliseconds of that is ventricular diastole. Okay. 3 is not a perfect representation of the 300 out of 800 ratio, but it does represent the fact that the heart's in diastole longer than it's in systole. Okay. And that brings the number down a little bit. Okay. So if we were using that equation to get mean arterial pressure, so instead of 2, we change that to 3, what would the value be instead of 100? It's actually, unless you're doing this on a calculator, you wouldn't get it exactly. It's 93 point, repeating 3s. Yeah. But so mean arterial pressure, based on the blood pressure measurement of 120/80, would be 93.3. Okay. What that means simply is that this gray line here is that representation of the average blood pressure in the range given the time that the heart's contracting versus the time that the heart's relaxed. And so the gray line starts here a little lower than 100 because of that, the 3 in the equation rather than the 2. Okay. Now, eventually the line does sort of drop off and it merges in with the line that's the rest of the more steady blood pressure that we see through the system. But it does kind of represent what's going on here. Now, the only time we actually deal with mean arterial pressure, the only time it actually comes up is a very special situation, and sorry, the only time it comes up in this course, very special situation in the kidneys where we're concerned with the blood pressure in part of the arterial circulation where blood's being filtered. But other than that, we don't really get too hung up on mean arterial pressure for this course. Okay. Which is actually to say that all the time I just spent explaining the mathematical way of calculating mean arterial pressure isn't terribly crucial. Okay. You're not going to be asked to calculate mean arterial pressure. I did it more so that you understand that it does represent less than the simple average between 120/80, representing what's actually going on in the heart. Okay. But we can say that there's just this line representing blood pressure throughout the system, and it continuously drops, especially so that it gets down to this range, wherever that is, the purple part for capillaries there. Because the change in blood pressure we see through capillaries is very important to how capillaries work, which we'll end with a little later on. Okay. When we measure the blood pressure, we're not actually measuring it at the aorta. And I'd almost say that this curve here, as it starts to fall off, is a little misleading. There's probably a bit more steady mean arterial pressure through most of the arteries, and then it falls off as we get into the smaller muscular arteries and the arterioles. So really anywhere in here that we look at blood pressure, it should be pretty much the same, whether we're talking specifically about the aorta or we're talking about where we actually tend to measure blood pressure. So speaking of measuring blood pressure, let me talk about that a little bit. So again, we have this red line representing the pressure generated from instant to instant by the beating heart. I didn't point it out in the previous picture, but there was a little representation of a bump right there as pressure's falling from the 120 back down to the 80. Okay. What does that little bump there represent? I pointed this bump out when we were talking about the pressures in the cardiac cycle. It has to do with the second sound. What makes the second sound?
Atrial system.
It's at the end of atrial systole. But why is there a sound when you're listening to the heart? Yeah, valves are closing. So which valve is closing, resulting in the second sound? Yeah, semilunars. And since we're talking about the left side, we're specifically talking about the aortic valve. This little bump right here represents the closure of the aortic valve. Okay, and you can see that when you're getting real-time data on blood pressure. You'll see a little, as it's dropping off from systolic pressure, there'll be a little bump in the system. That's the back pressure from the closing valve there. Now, the line here represents the pressure that's applied by a cuff, blood pressure cuff, wrapped around the upper arm. Now, in the upper arm, what we're wrapping that cuff around are these major arteries. The main one that we're interested in is the brachial artery. Okay. By wrapping that cuff around the upper arm and inflating it to above 120 millimeters of mercury, that's going to exert pressure on the brachial artery enough to close off the brachial artery, and no blood can be pumped through that artery. Okay. And then a stethoscope is applied on the inner elbow, right where the brachial artery would be emerging from where the cuff is. Now, the little valve on the cuff is released and pressure is bled off slowly. And when we listen to the stethoscope there on the distal side of the cuff at the brachial artery, when the pressure in the cuff is higher than blood pressure completely, the brachial artery is completely closed and there's no movement of blood through that. So when you're listening, you don't hear anything. And then when the blood pressure cuff gets to the point where it's a little bit lower than the pressure in the brachial artery, or the pressure coming from the beating heart, then there will be a little push of blood through the brachial artery at the peak of the cardiac cycle. And you'll hear a little sound, little whooshing sound. Some people describe it as a clicking or something like that. They're called Korotkov sounds. I think that's how you pronounce it. Obviously named after a dead Russian white guy. But all that means is, for a brief moment there, the pressure pushing blood through the system is higher than the pressure in the cuff, and you hear that sound as blood's being pushed through the brachial artery and coming out on the distal side from the cuff. Okay. And then as the pressure falls off in the cuff even more, there's more of a sound, and there's more of a sound, and there's more of a sound. So you can hear each heartbeat, okay, as it's pushing through. When the pressure in the cuff falls off to below the diastolic pressure, no longer does the brachial artery close off with each heartbeat. And so the sounds stop occurring. So you don't hear any more sounds because the brachial artery is staying open the whole time, no matter what pressure's in the system. The diastolic pressure is higher than the cuff pressure, so the brachial artery is always going to stay open. So those sounds, which are basically the blood whooshing through the brachial artery against the pressure in the cuff, stop because it no longer has to whoosh through with each beat. It's now going to be continuously moving through, and you stop hearing it. I've never taught somebody actually how to do this, and so if you've learned how to do this and the instructions you've gotten are not exactly what I say, don't think that I'm trying to tell you how to do it differently. This is just a way to explain it. If you're doing this and you're listening to, again, the brachial artery on the distal side of the cuff, while you're bleeding the pressure off in the cuff, the first time you hear a sound, whatever pressure you measure in the cuff, that's what's considered systolic pressure. And then as you're listening to that, the last sound you hear, whatever the pressure is in the cuff at that point, is diastolic pressure. Okay. I'm never listening to the stethoscope when my pressure is being taken, but I'm always kind of interested in paying attention. And before digital blood pressure monitors became common, and actually in a lot of offices, it's still done in a kind of analog fashion. You can watch the dial or the column or whatever it is that's actually representing the pressure in the system. And because the pressure is a little bit higher than the cuff every so often, that's going to make the needle bump a little bit each time it goes down. So I watch the needle and I count those kind of like the carotid cuff sounds are going to be. Okay. And I always kind of like to see if I can get the same number that the person that's taking my blood pressure does. It's not a perfect system, and I know that because I'm usually off from whatever they get. And it's usually always in the same way. And I can't remember now if it's, I see the needle move the first time, probably on the second sound, or something like that. But so I missed what would be the first sound, just because that little itty bitty sound means there's just a little bit of pressure that could potentially make the needle move. And it's probably not enough for me to actually see the needle moving on the dial or something like that. So I'm usually off a little bit. And then at the other end, by that time, I think people, especially that are very used to doing this, they're bleeding the pressure off so quickly at the end there, I can't really keep up with what they're doing. So I'm off a bit at the end just because it's going by too fast. But that's basically the idea. Now in this picture, we see some suggested real data for the blood pressure. And so the line representing the cuff pressure is just a little bit above 120, and then it has to just drop a little bit below 80. But in actuality, because you don't know what somebody's blood pressure is going to be, you actually need to inflate the cuff to very high pressure. Probably most people are told to inflate it to about 200. I'm certainly not going to tell somebody what to do in the doctor's office, but I really should say, you don't need to go up to 200 for me because I have low blood pressure. So they can start at 160 or 180 maybe. The problem with it is the tighter the cuff is, and especially the longer it takes the person to get the stethoscope in position, all that, as you're cutting off the blood flow through the brachial artery, that means that no blood is getting out to the distal part of the arm. And the tissue is going to start to react to that a little bit. So you get a little soreness in the arm there, especially when they don't get it quite right the first time and say, oh, let me do it again. And then I got to squeeze those off. So, but because there's no telling exactly what somebody's blood pressure is going to be, if you have no knowledge of their history, then you need to have it kind of high. If you start off at 160 saying, well, that's going to be more than 120, and the person that you're measuring, they have 180 over something, God forbid, then certainly there's going to be a problem there. So that's how blood pressure is measured. Let me go back to the book here before we get into the next picture. Now, if you thought my explanation of mean arterial pressure and taking averages and that kind of thing was a little troublesome because it used, oh my God, math. First off, deal with it. This is science. We use math. Second, it gets worse. So in this part of the chapter where it defines mean arterial pressure and talks about taking blood pressure, then it gets into considering what things affect blood flow and blood pressure. And here we want to really kind of consider what's at play when we think about regulating blood pressure, meaning how our homeostatic mechanisms really take care of this. And so here we get into some lovely math. So, okay, if you think, oh, lovely triangles, then you're going to enjoy this more than most people probably. But so first off, here's the scary part. That should probably scare the hell out of most people that don't really like math. Okay. The book does explain what all these things mean, and you're welcome to look at that. But I'm going to just sort of highlight the important things. And with that, I'm actually going to start here. This is what's important. Now we're trying to look at what it is that causes blood flow, what it is that gives us an ability to regulate blood flow. In a sense, it's kind of like cardiac output. Okay, we looked at cardiac output and we could modify it by changing heart rate or stroke volume. Here we can look at blood flow and we can model, regulate it by applying change to either of these two things here. Okay. In the numerator position in this ratio, the pretty triangle there is the Greek letter delta, which means change. So delta P really means a change in pressure. I mentioned this when we were talking about pressures in the heart, that a fluid of whatever sort, liquid, gas, whatever, is always going to move from high pressure to low pressure. So what that means is blood flow, the movement of this liquid tissue, is directly related to the amount of change in pressure within the system. Now, if we talk about the entire system, which is really what we're concentrating on here, the pressure of blood coming out of the left ventricle can be as high as 120 under normal conditions, compared to the pressure at the other end, which is practically zero. That change in pressure throughout all of systemic circulation is what drives blood flow. Okay. Now, if we were to look at blood flow in very specific areas, then the delta P, the change in pressure, would be different. But we're talking about systemic circulation here for the most part. So delta P just represents the entire pressure behind the system. And the mathematical relationship between these we would describe as blood flow is proportional to the change in pressure, the difference in pressure. Which means the greater the difference in pressure, the greater the blood flow. Okay. So if we can increase the pressure on one end of the system, then we're going to make the blood flow faster. Okay. That's what it means. The other thing down here is resistance. Now, I talked about resistance in lab. I know I talked about it yesterday. I remember talking about it. But I just want to make sure, did I talk about or define resistance in the Monday lab? Was I walking across the floor and I was dragging my feet? Did I do that?
Yeah.
That's resistance. Okay, that's what I was doing there. Resistance is really just the force acting against blood flow. And I demonstrated it by walking without picking up my feet, representing the friction between the soles of my feet and the floor makes it harder for me to walk. I can't walk as fast because there's resistance against the movement of my feet thanks to the friction against the floor. And then I went on to describe that a little bit more related to what's going on in blood circulation, because that's really tied mostly to the diameter of blood vessels. So I imagined if we dropped the ceiling in the room halfway down, I'd have to stoop down to walk, and I wouldn't be able to walk as fast as normal. Okay. That's what resistance is. Just it's inversely proportional to blood flow. As resistance increases, blood flow decreases. As it's harder for me to walk, I walk slower. That's what the demonstration in lab was about. Okay. So those are the major relationships we want to think about here. They then go on to rearrange this these relationships to this. And the point here, which it's not that we care more about resistance than anything else, the point here is to set up this equation, which gets us into the, potentially scary stuff here. It's just a rearrangement of this first equation so that we can think about what resistance really means. And they explain all these things are up there. Part of what I want to mention, the denominator down here, pi r to the fourth. Pi is the constant that's related to the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its radius. So pi times r, and r being the radius, to the power of 4 is one of the factors that influences the value of resistance. What that means here is that radius, or we usually think of it as diameter, which is just twice the radius, is directly responsible to determining what resistance is. It's in the denominator of this ratio, which means that as the radius or diameter of the blood vessel goes up, resistance goes down. Okay, which is really to say, well, the opposite of that, as diameter goes down, resistance goes up. Which, as far as we're concerned, what that means is when we constrict blood vessels, that's going to increase resistance and therefore lessen blood flow through the system. Now, the other thing that's important out of what this is saying, without getting too deep into the mathematical definitions, that power to 4 and the 8 in here get at the fact that the change in diameter can be very small and resistance will change quite a bit. For 1 unit of diameter change in a blood vessel, resistance will change 16-fold. To try to put this simply, it's not just that if we have a 2 centimeter wide vessel and it goes down to 1 centimeter that we double resistance. That's not how it works. Instead, if we go from 2 centimeters to, let's call it 1.9 centimeters, then resistance is going to go up by 1.6 times. Okay, so a 1/10 change in diameter is going to translate into a 16-fold increase, which would be 1.6 change in resistance. Now, as I was describing this to one of my weekly classes, and there's a guy in there that's just all about math. So as I'm talking about it, he's pulling out his calculator and he's pulling up actual numbers. And I did not commit those numbers to memory. So that 2 to 1.9 thing, I might be off on the exact numbers there, but he sort of proved it for that class mathematically, that if you plug the numbers in, you do in fact see huge changes in resistance with small changes in blood vessel diameter. And the reason that's important is we don't have to make blood vessels change in diameter a whole lot. When we constrict the blood vessel wall, when the tunica media contracts, a little bit of change in the diameter makes a big change in resistance, and therefore it can make a big change in blood flow. We are kind of thinking about a lot of this in terms of the entire systemic circulation. But if we're trying to decide whether blood's going to go to our skin or deep inside, like when we're trying to keep our bodies warm, if we constrict the blood vessels going to the skin a little bit, then the resistance is going to be really high going into the skin, and so blood's going to prefer to stay out of the skin. And so we'll keep our blood deeper underneath the subcutaneous adipose tissue, and we'll be able to insulate our bodies a little bit better. Okay. So I'm not really too concerned that you get too bogged down with these values here a whole lot. I do want to mention a couple of things, which is these 2 Greek letters here, eta, which looks like an N with an elephant trunk coming off of it, and lambda, which it's a lambda. I don't know how to make a funny description of what that looks like, but wishbone, that's good. In fact, it is, but that hasn't. Yeah. For this, lambda is used to. Oh, actually, I guess they are technically the same thing. Right, but if we think about it, L lambda corresponds to length, and here we're talking about the length of a blood vessel. Lambda also is used as a measure of the length of wavelength. It just on a very different scale. But yeah, so lambda is kind of a length measurement. So these 2 things point out that resistance is also going to be directly proportional to these 2 things. That's why the eta and the lambda are eta. Yeah, eta and the lambda are in the numerator. As blood viscosity goes up, then resistance goes up too. As blood vessel length goes up, resistance goes up too. Now, the blood viscosity thing means if your hematocrit number is high, then there's less blood in your, there's less water in your blood overall. So the resistance is going to be a little higher where blood's more viscous. The length thing, where that's important, is just when there's more blood vessels, there's a longer distance that blood has to move through, resistance will be higher, which will compromise the ability for blood to flow. The more tissue that you have, and usually when people are adding tissue to their body, they're adding adipose tissue to their body. The more tissue that you have, the more blood supply it needs, and therefore the more blood vessels there will be, and that length factor will play a role. Okay? One reason that obesity is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease is because blood vessel length equals resistance. Well, doesn't equal it, but corresponds to resistance. And so if you have more adipose tissue and therefore more blood vessels, your heart has to work harder to push blood back to the heart. Okay, so if we go to this picture here, if the distance from the heart back to the heart is longer, then the pressure will still drop off at the same rate. It's just it won't be enough to get all the way through the system, okay? Which that can't happen. So then what the heart has to do is to beat harder, which is going to increase the pressure on this end, and that's going to directly be related to high blood pressure. Okay. So that lambda value, it's kind of small to read now, but the lambda value in this resistance definition is basically saying that blood vessel length adds to resistance, which means that greater resistance, less blood flow. Okay. Those two things have to do with. Okay, where were we? No. Okay. So these four figures here are kind of looking at some different aspects of the relationships between blood flow, pressure, and resistance. All of them have along their y-axis the same sort of layout, which technically means distance from the heart. And from the heart, we go into the elastic arteries, and then into the muscular arteries, and then into the arterioles, and then the capillaries, and then into the venules, and then into the veins. Vena cava is just another vein. Why it's separated out, I'm not sure. In the previous picture, they had the aorta at the beginning. They didn't put the aorta in here because it is an elastic artery. And if they're going to do that, then why the heck don't they just leave the vena cava up at the end? Because it's just one of the veins. But that's the circulatory pathway. Coming off of the heart, the vessel diameter gets smaller and smaller. So the aorta has a vessel diameter of about 2.5 centimeters. And then as that branches out into more and more arteries, the arteries get smaller in diameter. And eventually we're going to get down to capillaries, which have an average diameter of 8 micrometers. Okay, so in this picture, it looks like it's pretty much 0 because on the scale over here of centimeters, 8 micrometers is impossible to distinguish from 0. Okay, so it gets all the way down here. And then the capillaries come together into venules, which are a little bit bigger, and the venules come together into the veins, which get bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, we get to the vena cava, which is very big. And notice that this end of the chart here, where the vena cava is higher than the end where the aorta is. The vena cava is wider than the aorta. And I talked a little bit about the difference in artery versus vein size in lab. So this is actually kind of getting at that. What this is saying, in any individual vessel of that type, the diameter is going to go down, which would mean resistance goes up quite a bit as we get towards the capillaries, and then the resistance falls off again, and in fact gets very low as we get to the veins. Looking at individual vessels. The next figure here, we again have the same layout of the types of vessels, and we're looking at the cross-sectional area of the vessels. Now, the cross-sectional area of the aorta, the beginning of this thing, is going to be pi times 1.2 centimeters squared. Pi r squared is the area of the circle. And if the diameter of the aorta is 2.5 centimeters, and its radius is 1.25 centimeters. So that's its cross-sectional area. Okay. As we move on here, though diameter is dropping off as we move into smaller and smaller vessels, the cross-sectional area isn't changing because this is the collective cross-sectional area of all of the vessels at that stage. There's only one aorta, so its cross-sectional area is simply the relationship I just described. But as we move out into the smaller elastic arteries and muscular arteries, we get more and more vessels, each of them individually having a smaller diameter, but collectively they represent more cross-sectional area. The way that I capture this on the screen, I really can't depict what I want to, so I'm going to put it on this board, and those of you that are not here today, deal with it. So, okay, so let's say this is a cross-section of the aorta, okay? It has 2.5 centimeter diameter. So its area, and I really hope I'm making the area of a circle equation right. I always get them mixed up, but it should be pi r squared, which means that it's pi times 1.25 squared. Whatever that comes out to be, I don't care. Okay? But that's how we calculate it. From the aorta, there are going to be smaller and smaller vessels branching off, which might be, let's say, and I don't think I'm drawing this exactly to scale, 0.25 centimeters, which means that their area is going to be pi times, not 1.25, 0.125 squared. Okay, so the cross-sectional area is going to be a lot smaller for that vessel, but there's a lot more of them. Okay, so if we look at the cross-sectional area of all of these together, then it's going to probably come out to something pretty close to the cross-sectional area of that one aorta. And what we see as we move through this curve, it starts to actually pick up when we're getting into the really, really thin vessels. And especially when we get down to the capillaries, the value really peaks up here. Okay. While the cross-sectional area of the aorta by itself is that value, when we look at the cross-sectional area of all of the capillaries in our body at the same time, we get this huge difference here. That kind of offsets what we would think of as the real drop-off in resistance based on vessel diameter. Okay. Sure, in each individual vessel, the resistance is very high, and therefore that's going to compromise blood flow through that. But the blood has to flow. It has to go somewhere. So if we're talking about a single vessel getting narrower, then the blood's going to go to another branch that's wider. But if all of the vessels are all narrower, then the blood just has to go across all of them. Yes?
Does oxygenated blood versus deoxygenated blood have any effect on resistance?
Not the oxygenation state. There is another aspect that's coincidental with that, which I'll mention later on. Okay. But yeah, the oxygenation state doesn't have any significant effect that I know of. Okay. Now, I've tried to suggest what this would be like, and the best I've ever been able to come up with is imagine that you have 1,000 people that all need to get into a building at once, okay? And on the side of the building, you have one door, okay? It's a big garage-style door that you can open up, okay? And the area of that door is equal to the area of those 1,000 people. So you could conceivably push all 1,000 people through that door at once. But that doesn't really happen very well, because the door isn't person-shaped or 1,000-person shaped. So it takes a little bit of time for all of the people to enter through that door. more efficient way of getting all the people into the building is to have 1,000 little doors that are each big enough for one person to go through. So they can each walk through their own door at the same time, and they'll all get into the building at the same time. Okay. That's the idea that I want you to get out of this, that one big vessel versus lots of small vessels is actually going to counteract the resistance that we would expect to see with the drop off in diameter here. Now, that example is a horrible example. Okay, there's all sorts of problems. It doesn't really translate to what we're talking about, but I think that's a fairly good idea, the difference that one big door doesn't necessarily accommodate everybody going through it very easily at once, but 1,000 little doors can. Okay? And so the huge number of capillaries there, though they're each individually very small, collectively represent a lot of area for blood to flow through. Okay. So these top two are basically getting at the interplay of vessel size and resistance. Okay. Then here we have the average blood pressure, and this picture is really just this picture here. Okay, so looking at the mean arterial pressure going into the constant pressure through the rest of the system, we just have it drawn there. Now, kind of unfortunately, they actually started 100 instead of 93.3 like we determined earlier, but whatever. The point is that pressure drops off as we move away from the heart. And we basically saw that. This curve is in fact not really a very accurate representation of the curve that we looked at before. It's but it does give the same impression. Pressure drops off as we go through there. Now, if we combine the change in pressure across the system with the change in resistance across the system, we can look at blood flow. So blood flow is very high coming out of the heart, and it actually drops down as we get to the smaller and smaller vessels, but it doesn't completely go to zero. Okay, the amount of resistance drop off based on vessel diameter should suggest that blood flow just dead stops when we get to capillaries. But in fact, it doesn't, because to offset that, the vast number of capillaries means that there's a lot of space for the blood to flow through. It might be moving kind of slowly, but it's going to get through there. And then as vessel diameter increases as we get into the venous return, flow increases even though pressure decreases. And again, that's something that I made a point of in lab, looking at the micrograph of the artery next to the vein. Now, I'm not explaining all of this to the greatest detail. I just want to get you to understand the interplay between pressure and resistance. Okay. And largely what we can do to affect blood flow and regulate what's going on in the vasculature is really just to play with vessel diameter. Okay. And so as we play with vessel diameter, we can regulate where blood flows. These pictures are looking at the entire systemic circuit of circulation. But if we want blood to go to our digestive organs preferentially, then we can change the diameter of some of those vessels and go there. If we want the blood to go preferentially to our skeletal muscle, we'll change the diameter of other vessels. Okay. And we talked about that a little bit when we were talking about the autonomic system, that blood vessels and skeletal muscles respond differently to the sympathetic input than the blood vessels elsewhere in your body. And that's because we have wired in to the system a way to ensure that blood flow goes to a specific place during the sympathetic response. Okay. What we're looking at here is really just across the entire system, but we can think of it a little bit more particularly in different areas. Now, there's a little bit more that we have to help blood flow get back, or help blood flow back to the heart here in the venous return. Because as that pressure drops off, that really does compromise blood flow. But we need to have blood flowing back to the heart to some degree. And so there are other things that play a role. And in the book, oops, they're talking about the venous system, and they describe two main ways that this works. There's the skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump. And obviously there's a picture for the skeletal pump, which we see here. Now, veins have valves in them. Okay? When they're closed, blood cannot go back through the valve. When they're open, blood can go up through the valve. Valves and veins work on the exact same principles of the valves we talked about in the heart. That they ensure that blood flows in just one direction. Now, to help blood flow up from our lower extremities, meaning our legs, against the force of gravity, we have this muscular pump. What that means is the heart is the pump for the circulatory, for the cardiovascular system. But here at the end, we need a little bit of help. So we take advantage of the properties of contracting skeletal muscle to help the blood move on a little bit more. This is considered a passive pumping process. As far as your cardiovascular system is concerned, it's not expending any energy to do this. Your skeletal muscles are, but your skeletal muscles aren't doing it for the sake of cardiovascular circulation. They're doing it for the sake of doing their normal jobs. So this picture, let's suggest that this is the lower leg. So we're looking at the calf muscles, the gastrocnemius and the soleus. Well, probably mostly the gastrocnemius here. So there's a blood vessel going through the muscle. Okay, we have two bellies of a muscle on either side of the vessel, which would be like the gastroc. When we're walking and the calf muscles are contracting to cause plantar flexion and we push off of the foot, when that contraction happens, we squeeze the vein that's in the middle of the muscle. Now, we could have maybe had a third picture or an earlier picture here showing blood coming in from below. Okay, so blood's going to work its way through this valve to get into this segment of the vein. Okay. In this set of pictures, they're showing it already there. Okay, but understand that that blood came from somewhere. And then when the muscles contract, they squeeze this part of the vein. Because there's a valve down here that's closed, the blood can't go down. Okay. The only way it can go is up. And it can push through this valve because the valve's oriented for that direction of movement. And so the idea behind the skeletal muscle pump is simply that as skeletal muscles contract, especially in the lower leg, they help to pump blood out of the veins using the valve system so it goes up against the force of gravity. Now, if you're sitting for a long time, you really should get up and walk around a little bit. Now, partly for convenience, I say that it's about a 2-hour point. Okay. Now, I say that for convenience because that means I don't have to ask you to get up and walk around in the middle of the lab. But when I have classes that are longer than that, 3 or 4 hours long, I'll purposely take a break in the middle of it so that my students can get up and walk around. Just all of you happen to be in my classes that are longer than my rule of thumb for how long to do that. But if you were in one of my other ones, we take breaks in the middle of class so people can actually get up and move around. Some people don't, they just get out their phones and start playing with those. But I'm doing my part, I'm giving you your opportunity to do that. And you know, young people playing with their phones, their cardiovascular system's probably just fine for them. But these kids today, I swear. Anyways, but more importantly, and as I'm thinking about flying to Chicago shortly, if you're sitting down for a long time, definitely get up and walk around. So maybe a flight to Chicago is not that bad. I think it's like an hour and 45 minutes or something like that. But I flew out to San Diego a long time ago now, about 10 years ago. And I had to get up and walk up and down the aisle of the plane quite a bit. Now, I have some problems with circulation. I just have some cardiac problems in general. So I'm very aware of it. But really, people should be on long plane flights like that, getting up and walking around a little bit. Okay. I don't really want to get into everything that's going on a plane, but there's more issues to it than just your legs not moving, because the air pressure in the cabin is different than the air pressure at sea level, and that can actually play havoc a little bit with the cardiovascular system. So there's lots of reasons to do that. But just in general, if you're sitting for a long time, like if you take a long car ride, if you're going to, I don't know, Buffalo for some reason, stop every so often, get out of the car, walk around. It's good for circulation in your legs. If you don't do that, then you run the risk of the blood sort of pooling up in the veins down here. It can start to clot, okay? Platelets can be activated just sitting around. They'll run into each other and they'll activate each other and they'll cause a clot, which is not a good thing. The weight of the blood in the vein, if the walls of the vein are a little weak, especially as happens as people get older, that can stretch the veins out and you start to get varicose veins. Okay. So there are lots of good reasons to get up and walk around if you're seated for a long time. Okay. With that in mind, I'm going to dismiss you in a couple of minutes to get up and walk around. But I just want to make sure I hit everything I wanted to in this chapter. Oh, the other one here, they don't have a picture of it, the respiratory pump. Just as you're breathing, as your chest is expanding, as you're inhaling air, and then it collapses as you exhale air, actually makes for a difference in pressure between your abdominal and thoracic cavities, which helps to get blood up the last little bit through the inferior vena cava. Oh, one last thing I want to point out, and this is actually going to kind of lead into what we start on Tuesday. If we look at the capillaries and think about that pressure fall off, whoops. So here, when we're in the capillaries, the purple part of this curve, pressure's falling from about 35 to about, I think it's 16 is what the book uses, millimeters of pressure mercury. Yeah. And that's what they say here. So blood coming in from the arterial side is going to have a pressure of about 35 millimeters of mercury. And when it leaves the capillaries to the venous side, it's going to have about 18 millimeters of mercury, not 16, but whatever. That drop in pressure actually is the basis of why things move in and out of capillaries. There are other forces at play. The most important one, which is sort of the only one the book's mentioning here, is blood colloidal osmotic pressure. What that means is in the blood, you have things like blood cells and then the plasma proteins, that sort of thing, making the blood hypertonic to some degree. And so water in the surrounding tissue wants to move into the blood. That's the blood colloid osmotic pressure. The force behind that is about 25 millimeters of mercury, which is constant. So at the arterial end, the blood pressure is about 10 millimeters of mercury higher than the osmotic pressure. At the venous end, the osmotic pressure is about 7 millimeters of mercury higher than the blood pressure, or blood is 7 millimeters of mercury less. Those two differences, a positive blood pressure difference on this side causes filtration, and a negative blood pressure difference on the other side allows for reabsorption. So nutrients that are in your blood can get into the surrounding tissue, and waste products that are in the surrounding tissue can get back into the blood. That's the basis of the movement of those two things. Now, the offset isn't exactly the same. There's a higher pressure driving filtration, 10 millimeters of mercury, then there's pressure driving reabsorption, 7 millimeters of mercury. Along with the nutrients and wastes that are moving, also, since all of this is happening in solution, there's going to be water molecules moving. You filter more water out of your blood than you reabsorb at the other end, okay? And that leads into us to start talking about what the lymphatic system is on Tuesday. With that, I also want to pick up the question Jennifer had about, oxygenation state of blood. That's not involved, but this difference here, we go from the oxygenated blood on this side to the deoxygenated blood on this side, and other changes, mostly about the water, is also going to have an effect on blood flow. So I'm going to pick up with this next time, setting up what the lymphatic system is about. Okay, so go out there, walk around, pump the blood out of your legs.